They were lined up under the blinding sun, hands trembling, convinced it was their final hour. Captured Italian soldiers, hungry, filthy, and broken, stood ready for what they thought would be execution by the Americans. But instead of bullets, came the smell of roasted turkey, warm bread, and laughter. The guards weren't sneering, they were serving. Plates of food, music, and kindness shattered everything the prisoners thought they knew about their enemy. That night, the Italians realized that the real power of America wasn't in its weapons, but in its humanity. The North African sun had burned away any illusions of glory. Lieutenant Carlo Romano lay flat against the sand, tasting blood and dust, while artillery fire shook the ground like the fists of angry gods. Around him, what remained of his regiment, boys from Naples and Sicily who'd believed Mussolini's promises, huddled behind a collapsed stone wall that offered no real protection. When the American tanks rolled over the ridge, Carlo knew it was finished. His pistol held 3 rounds. His men had perhaps 20 rifles between 40 soldiers. The white flag one of his corporals raised was made from a torn undershirt, stained brown with desert grit. The Americans came quickly, efficiently. They shouted words Carlo barely understood, gesturing with rifle barrels for the Italians to stand with hands raised. Carlo rose slowly, his knees protesting, his uniform dark with sweat and someone else's blood. Sergeant Enzo De Luca stood beside him, barely 20 years old, his face hollow with exhaustion and terror. "They will shoot us now," Enzo whispered in Italian, his voice cracking. "My mother always said I would die far from home." "Stand straight," Carlo hissed back, forcing his spine rigid despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We are officers of Italy. We die with dignity." But the Americans didn't shoot. Instead, they searched the prisoners roughly but not cruelly, taking weapons and watches, binding hands with rope that cut into Carlo's wrists. An American captain with pale eyes and a sunburned nose walked down the line of captured men, studying each face. When he reached Carlo, he paused. "Officer?" the captain asked in accented Italian. Carlo nodded stiffly. "Lieutenant Carlo Romano, 5th Infantry Regiment." The American captain, his name tag read Harris, nodded once. "You and your men will be transported to a detention facility. Cooperate and no harm comes to you. Resist, and we respond accordingly. Understand?" Carlo translated for his men, though most had grasped the meaning from Harris's tone. Relief and dread warred on their faces. They would not die today. But tomorrow? Next week? The stories they'd heard about American brutality, about prisoner camps where men worked until they dropped, where guards shot anyone who stepped out of line, those stories filled the silence as they were loaded onto trucks. The journey took 3 days. They traveled in covered military vehicles, 30 men packed shoulder to shoulder, breathing recycled heat and fear. Guards gave them water twice daily and hard biscuits that tasted like sawdust. No one spoke much. Enzo clutched a wooden rosary his grandmother had pressed into his palm before he left Rome, his lips moving in constant prayer. On the second night, packed into a train car that smelled of livestock and diesel, Carlo watched his men through the darkness. Some slept fitfully. Others stared at nothing, their eyes already dead. One boy, barely 18, name of Paolo Ricci, sobbed quietly into his hands until an older corporal, Vincent Santoro, put an arm around his shoulders. "They say Americans don't take prisoners," Paolo whispered. "They say we'll be worked in mines until we die." "They say many things," Vincent replied, though his voice held no conviction. "We're alive now. That's enough." But Carlo knew it wasn't enough. He'd seen the way Harris looked at them, not with hatred exactly, but with something harder to name. Assessment. Calculation. As if deciding what they were worth. The Americans had lost men too. Brothers, sons, friends. Why would they show mercy to those who'd killed them? When the train finally stopped and the doors rolled open, blinding American sunlight poured in. They had crossed an ocean somehow, been transported to a world that looked nothing like the desert they'd left. Green fields stretched endlessly, wooden buildings with white paint, a flag with stars and stripes snapping in clean wind. "Move out," an American guard barked, gesturing with his rifle. Single file. No talking. They stumbled down from the train, legs stiff from confinement, blinking against the brightness. Carlo counted roughly 200 Italian prisoners on the platform, all wearing the same haunted expressions, all wondering if they would see another sunrise. Enzo gripped Carlo's sleeve as they marched. "Where are we?" "America," Carlo said quietly. "Somewhere in the middle of America. Will they kill us here?" Carlo had no answer. He simply put one foot in front of the other, following the Americans into whatever fate awaited them. The camp appeared at the end of a dirt road flanked by cornfields that swayed in the summer breeze. Carlo had expected barbed wire coiled like steel serpents, guard towers bristling with machine guns, perhaps dogs straining at leashes. What he saw instead made him question his exhausted eyes. The fence was there, certainly, but it looked almost decorative chain link, maybe 10 feet high, with a simple gate. No electrification humming, no searchlights cutting through the dusk. Beyond it stood rows of wooden barracks, freshly painted white, arranged in neat lines around a central square. An American flag hung from a pole in the middle, surrounded by flower beds someone had actually tended. "This is a trick," muttered Vincent Santoro, standing near Carlo in the processing line. "Make us comfortable before they work us to death. Psychological warfare." But as they passed through the gate, Carlo noticed other details that didn't fit the narrative of cruelty. The guards carried rifles, yes, but they weren't pointed at prisoners. They hung loosely at sides or rested on shoulders. One guard was drinking coffee from a metal cup, chatting with a colleague about baseball. Another was reading a newspaper, his chair tilted back against a barracks wall. Captain Harris stood near the main office, a simple structure with a covered porch. He watched the prisoners file past, his expression unreadable. When Carlo's group approached, Harris stepped forward. "You'll be assigned to barracks," Harris announced in his careful Italian. 4 men per room. You'll receive bedding, washing supplies, and a change of clothes. Mess hall serves 3 meals daily. Work assignments begin tomorrow: farming, maintenance, nothing strenuous. Questions? Silence. The Italians exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. This couldn't be real. Comfortable quarters? 3 meals? Light work? It had to be a prelude to something worse. Enzo raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, when will the interrogations begin?" Harris's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You were already processed. No interrogations unless you have intelligence to volunteer. You're prisoners of war, not criminals." "And the executions?" Paolo Ricci blurted, then clapped a hand over his mouth, horrified at his own boldness. Harris's expression hardened, but not with anger, with something closer to sadness. "There will be no executions. You surrendered honorably. You'll be treated according to international law. Is that clear?" No one answered. They simply didn't believe him. The barracks rooms were sparse but clean. 4 metal beds with thin mattresses, a table, 2 chairs, a window with actual glass. Enzo ran his hand over the bed frame, as if it might vanish under his touch. "They're going to kill us," he whispered after the guards left. "That's why they're being kind. So we don't riot. So we go quietly." Carlo sat heavily on his assigned bed, feeling the springs creak beneath him. Every muscle in his body ached. Every thought in his mind circled the same drain of dread. "Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe they really will follow their laws. Since when do conquerors follow laws?" Vincent said bitterly. He stood at the window, staring out at the unfamiliar landscape. "We've been taught what Americans are. Brutal, materialistic, without culture or honor. Propaganda," Carlo said quietly. "We were taught many things, and if the propaganda was true, that question hung in the air, unanswerable. When darkness fell, none of them slept. They lay on their beds fully clothed, boots still laced, waiting for the sound of boots in the hallway, the rattle of locks, the orders to line up for the firing squad. Somewhere in the camp, someone began to pray aloud the Lord's Prayer in Latin, the familiar words drifting through thin walls. Other voices joined until the entire barracks hummed with desperate supplication. Carlo found his own lips moving, though he wasn't sure he believed anymore. Not in God, not in mercy, not in anything except the certainty that morning would bring revelation, one way or another. But morning brought only breakfast. The guards roused them at 6 with brisk knocks, directing them toward the mess hall. Carlo moved like a man in a dream, his mind refusing to process the normalcy of it all. The mess hall smelled of coffee and oatmeal. American soldiers sat at some tables while Italian prisoners filled others, the two groups eyeing each other warily across the space between. The food was simple but substantial. Porridge with milk, bread with butter, coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than burned grain. Carlo ate mechanically, his stomach rebelling after days of near starvation followed by sudden plenty. "This doesn't make sense," Enzo said, staring at his half-empty bowl. "Why feed us well if they plan to kill us?" "Because they're not going to kill us," snapped an older prisoner named Giuseppe Moretti, who'd been captured weeks earlier. "Accept it. We're workers now. Cheap labor for their farms. They keep us healthy so we're productive." It was a cynical explanation, but at least it was logical. Carlo clung to it as they were assigned to work details. His group was sent to a nearby farm where they pulled weeds from soybean fields under the supervision of a single guard who mostly dozed under a tree. The work was easy, almost insultingly so. Yet every moment, Carlo waited for the trap to spring, for the true nature of their captivity to reveal itself. That night, lying in his bunk with his body merely tired rather than destroyed, he realized the waiting itself was its own form of torture. The uncertainty ate at him worse than hardship would have. "I wish they would just tell us," Enzo whispered in the darkness. "Whatever they plan to do, I wish they would just do it." Carlo had no comfort to offer, so he remained silent, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. The third day brought the first real conflict. It started small, a misunderstanding over laundry procedures. An American guard named Thompson gestured toward a clothesline and made washing motions, trying to communicate that the prisoners should clean their own uniforms. But his tone was brusque, his gestures sharp, and to exhausted men primed for cruelty, it looked like mockery. Vincent Santoro threw down the shirt he'd been holding. "We're not animals," he said in rapid Italian, his face flushed. "If you want us to work, give us proper orders. If you want to humiliate us, just shoot us and be done with it." Thompson didn't understand the words, but he heard the defiance. His hand dropped to his sidearm. The other prisoners froze. For a moment, the camp yard held its breath. Then Captain Harris appeared from the administrative building, his boots crunching on gravel as he strode toward the confrontation. He spoke quietly to Thompson, who reluctantly stepped back. Harris turned to Vincent with an expression of weary patience. "What's the problem, soldier?" Vincent gestured angrily at the laundry. "We don't understand what you want. No one explains. You point and grunt like we're stupid. If you're going to treat us like dogs, why pretend otherwise?" Harris was quiet for a moment, studying Vincent's face. Then he surprised everyone by picking up a dirty shirt himself and walking to the washing station. He demonstrated slowly: soap, water, scrubbing, rinsing, hanging. Simple motions. When he finished, he looked at Vincent. "That clear enough?" Vincent's anger deflated into confusion. An American captain had just done laundry to make a point. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this strange inversion of hierarchy. But the damage was done. Word spread through the camp that the Americans were trying to break their spirit through kindness, through the deliberate confusion of expectations. It was psychological warfare, the prisoners decided. Make them comfortable. Keep them off balance, then strike when their guard was down. The tension increased when the guards ordered all prisoners to shower and receive new clothes that afternoon. Enzo's face went white as he stood in line outside the bathhouse. "This is it," he breathed. "They're preparing us. Clean clothes. Final bath. Like condemned men before execution." Paolo Ricci began to shake, his breath coming in short gasps. "I don't want to die. Please, Madonna. I don't want to die." Carlo wanted to reassure them, but his own heart hammered against his ribs. The pattern fit too perfectly with the stories they'd heard about Nazi camps, about prisoners marched to showers that released gas instead of water. He thought of his sister back in Rome, how she would never know what happened to him. His parents would receive a telegram, missing in action. They would imagine him dying heroically in battle, not naked and terrified in a foreign bathhouse. The showers turned out to be exactly that, showers. Hot water, harsh soap that smelled of lye, rough towels. The new clothes were standard issue, American military surplus, too large for most of the Italians, but clean and whole. No tricks, no gas, just the humiliating necessity of standing vulnerable before guards who watched impassively to ensure no one tried to escape. Afterward, dressed in oversized khaki shirts and trousers, the prisoners gathered in small clusters around the barracks. The relief of survival mixed with a deeper anxiety. If not today, then when? What were the Americans waiting for? That night, Father Domenico Russo, a priest captured while serving as a chaplain, led evening prayers in the largest barracks. Nearly 100 men crowded inside, kneeling on the wooden floor, responding to the familiar Latin phrases with voices rough from emotion and uncertainty. "Why do they treat us this way?" someone asked when the prayers ended. "If they want to kill us, why delay? If they want to work us, why feed us well? What do they want?" Father Russo was a small man with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly. He'd seen combat, buried boys in shallow graves, heard final confessions from men whose intestines spilled into the sand. But here, surrounded by kindness he didn't understand, he looked lost. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "they simply believe in treating prisoners with dignity. Perhaps their laws mean something to them. Or perhaps," Vincent countered, "they're fattening us for slaughter, making us compliant." The arguments continued long into the night, circular and unresolvable. Carlo lay in his bunk listening to the familiar sound of men trying to make sense of the senseless. Soldiers were trained for clear enemies and defined objectives. This strange mercy was harder to endure than straightforward cruelty would have been. In the darkness, Enzo's whisper reached him. "Carlo, do you believe in God anymore?" "I don't know," Carlo admitted. "Do you?" "I'm praying like I do, but I'm not sure anyone's listening." "Keep praying anyway," Carlo said. "If there's even a chance someone hears, we need all the help we can get." But privately, staring at the ceiling beams barely visible in the gloom, Carlo wondered if God had abandoned them long before they set foot in this confusing prison. Or perhaps God was testing them, seeing if men could recognize grace when it wore an enemy's face. The announcement came on the 7th day, delivered by Captain Harris during the morning assembly. The prisoners stood in loose formation in the central square, the August sun already hot on their necks, waiting for work assignments. Harris climbed onto a small platform, his expression unreadable as always. He held a piece of paper but didn't consult it. "Tomorrow evening," he said in his careful Italian, "all prisoners will report to the recreation hall at 6 o'clock. Attendance is mandatory. Clean uniforms required." He stepped down without further explanation. The guards began calling out work details as if nothing unusual had been announced. But the Italians remained frozen, exchanging glances heavy with dread. "The recreation hall," Enzo said numbly. "Where is that?" "The large building near the north fence," Vincent replied. "I've seen guards go in and out, but we've never been allowed inside. Big enough to fit all of us," Giuseppe Moretti added quietly. "Big enough for a mass execution." The word sent a ripple through the gathered prisoners. Several crossed themselves. Paolo Ricci's face crumpled, and he turned away quickly to hide tears. Even the cynics who'd convinced themselves they would simply be worked to exhaustion now faced the possibility they'd been wrong, that mercy had never been the plan. Carlo felt his throat constrict. 7 days. They'd been given exactly 1 week of decent treatment before the reckoning. It made a terrible kind of sense. Long enough for the prisoners to lower their guard, to start hoping, to believe the propaganda about American values. And then, Maybe it's not what we think, he said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe it's a briefing. New work assignments. A speech about camp rules. In the largest building, Vincent said flatly. At evening. With mandatory attendance. Clean uniforms. He laughed bitterly. They want us presentable for whatever comes next. That night, sleep was impossible. Men paced in their barracks or knelt beside their beds in prayer. Some wrote letters home. Though male privileges hadn't been granted yet, they wrote anyway, pouring out final words to mothers and wives and children they would never see again. Father Russo moved from room to room, offering confession, blessing those who requested it, his own face gray with exhaustion and fear. Carlo sat at the small table in his quarters, a pencil in his hand and a blank piece of paper before him. He wanted to write to his sister, Maria, wanted to tell her he'd tried to be brave, that he'd thought of her and their parents every day, that he hoped she would remember him as he'd been before the war, laughing, full of plans, convinced the world was fundamentally good. But what could he say? The censors would read it. And if he was wrong, if tomorrow brought something other than execution, he would have burdened her with false grief. Better to say nothing than to say goodbye prematurely. You should write, Enzo said softly from his bunk. Even if they never send it. Even if we're wrong about tomorrow. You should tell your family. You love them. Do you have family? Carlo asked, realizing he'd never asked before. A mother. 3 sisters. A girl I wanted to marry named Lucia. Enzo smiled sadly. I haven't seen any of them in 2 years. They probably think I'm already dead. Then write to them. Tell them you're alive. That you've been treated well. That you're not afraid. But I am afraid. Then lie, Carlo said gently. Give them that gift. Enzo nodded and pulled out his own paper. For an hour, the only sound in the room was the scratch of pencils and the occasional sniffle as grown men wept quietly over their inadequate words. The next day passed in a haze. Work details continued. The Americans maintained the fiction of normalcy, but guards watched the prisoners more closely. Hands never far from weapons. The Italians moved like condemned men, slow and mechanical, their minds already elsewhere. At 5:30, they were ordered back to barracks to change into their cleanest uniforms. Carlo buttoned his shirt with numb fingers, noting how his hands had stopped shaking. He'd moved past fear into a strange calm. Whatever came, came. At least the uncertainty would end. At 10 minutes to 6, the guards marched them toward the recreation hall. The building loomed ahead, its windows covered with American flags for some reason. The door stood open, but the interior was dark. As the prisoners approached in ragged columns, Carlo heard music drifting out, American jazz, incongruous and jarring. Why music? Enzo whispered. To cover the sound of gunfire. Someone behind them muttered. They filed through the door into darkness. Carlo's eyes struggled to adjust after the bright evening sunshine. He could make out shapes, tables perhaps, arranged in rows. And candles. Why would there be candles at an execution? Then the lights blazed on. The recreation hall was transformed. Long tables covered in white cloths filled the space, each set with plates and silverware that gleamed under electric lights. The American flags on the walls were decorations, not shrouds. At the far end, a group of American soldiers with instruments, a piano, a trumpet, a drum played a swing tune that bounced off the wooden walls. And the smell. Carlo's legs nearly buckled as the aroma hit him. Roasted meat, baked bread, something sweet and spiced. Real food. The kind he hadn't smelled in more than a year. Captain Harris stood at the front of the hall in his dress uniform, freshly shaved, his expression still unreadable but perhaps touched with something that might have been satisfaction. When the last prisoner filed in and the confused murmuring had died down, he raised his voice. Gentlemen, he said in Italian, then repeated in English for the American soldiers who lined the walls. Tonight, you dine not as prisoners, but as men. This meal is offered in recognition of your service to your country and in hope that when this war ends, we might all return home with some measure of dignity intact. Please. Sit. No one moved. The Italians stood frozen, trying to process what they were seeing, what they were hearing. It couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination born of stress and fear. Harris gestured toward the tables. Sit, he repeated, more gently. You're not in danger. This is simply dinner. Slowly, disbelieving, the prisoners began to move toward the tables. Carlo found himself sitting between Enzo and Vincent, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it might disappear. Other prisoners sat with the same stunned expressions, looking at the plates before them as if they might transform into something sinister at any moment. The American soldiers began to move among the tables, carrying platters. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter. They served the prisoners with the same efficiency they'd shown in every other task, setting food on plates, filling water glasses, even offering second helpings. One young American private with red hair and freckles stopped beside Enzo's chair, a bowl of potatoes in his hands. He smiled uncertainly. Hungry? He asked in accented Italian. Enzo stared at him, then at the potatoes, then back at the soldier's face, his eyes filled with tears. He nodded mutely, unable to speak. The private spooned a generous portion onto Enzo's plate. It's good, he said simply. My mom's recipe. It was too much. The absurdity, the kindness, the complete inversion of everything they'd prepared themselves to face. Around the hall, grown men began to weep, openly silent tears running down faces, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Not from fear this time, but from relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. Carlo looked down at his plate piled with food and felt something crack open inside his chest. For a long time, no one ate. The Italians simply stared at their plates, as if the food were some elaborate mirage that would vanish if they reached for it. The American jazz band continued playing not loudly, but with a gentle swing that filled the awkward silence. Guards who might have been pointing rifles were instead passing bread baskets and refilling water glasses. Carlo watched Captain Harris move through the room, stopping at tables to exchange a few words with both prisoners and his own men. The captain's Italian wasn't fluent, but he made the effort, his face serious as he spoke about simple things, the weather, the quality of the harvest, the difficulty of finding good coffee during wartime. It was Enzo who finally broke the spell at their table. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped his fork, but he managed to spear a piece of turkey and bring it to his mouth. His eyes closed as he chewed. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. Madre di Dio, he whispered. It's real. It's actually real. That was permission enough. Carlo cut into his own meat, the knife sliding through tender flesh that had been cooked with care and seasoning. The first bite flooded his mouth with flavors he'd almost forgotten existed: rosemary, butter, salt, that wasn't just for preserving but for enhancing. His throat tightened. He had to pause and breathe deeply before he could swallow. Around the hall, the same scene played out at every table. Prisoners eating slowly at first, then faster, then slowing again as they remembered to taste, to savor. Bread disappeared. Gravy soaked into mashed potatoes. Green beans, simple green beans, were consumed as if they were delicacies from a royal kitchen. Vincent Santoro ate with tears streaming down his face, making no attempt to hide them. My grandmother, he said between bites, used to make beans like this, with onions and a little pork fat. I thought I'd never taste anything like it again. At the next table, Giuseppe Moretti had stopped eating altogether and was simply holding a piece of bread in both hands, staring at it as if it were a holy relic. Father Russo, sitting nearby, reached over and gently touched the old soldier's shoulder. They shared a look that needed no words. The American private with red hair returned to their table with a pitcher of what appeared to be lemonade. He poured carefully, his young face earnest. Homemade. He explained in his broken Italian. Camp cook's wife sent the recipe. What's your name? Carlo heard himself ask in English simple words he'd learned before the war, when he dreamed of traveling to America as a tourist, not a prisoner. The private looked surprised, then pleased. Danny Morrison. From Iowa. You speak English? Little. Carlo admitted. Very little. But thank you for this. He gestured at the table. The food. The incomprehensible kindness of it all. Danny Morrison smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. War's hell, sir. Doesn't mean we have to be. He moved on to the next table, and Carlo watched him go. This boy who might be 19, who probably had a mother waiting at home, who'd been taught to see Italians as enemies but chose to see them as human instead. The band shifted to a slower tune, something melodic and wistful. Carlo didn't recognize the song, but the emotion in it transcended language. He looked around the hall at 200 men eating together, some in American uniforms, others in Italian, all of them young, all of them far from home, all of them trying to survive a war they hadn't started. Enzo had finished his main course and was now staring with wonder at the slice of apple pie that had appeared on his plate. I don't understand, he said quietly. Why are they doing this? Does it matter? Vincent said. For the first time since their capture, his voice held something other than bitterness. Maybe they're just decent people. During war? Especially during war, Father Russo said from the next table. Having overheard, when it would be easier to be cruel, choosing kindness means more. The dessert was extraordinary apple pie with a flaky crust that melted on the tongue, sweetened just enough, the apples soft but not mushy. Carlo ate slowly, making each bite last, aware that this moment existed outside normal time. Tomorrow, they would return to being prisoners. But tonight, for these few hours, they were simply men sharing a meal. Somewhere near the back of the hall, someone began to sing. Carlo recognized the melody immediately, Santa Lucia, a Neapolitan folk song that every Italian knew. The voice was rough but earnest, carrying the ancient lyrics about home and harbor and the promise of peace. Other voices joined in, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The song swelled through the hall, 200 Italian prisoners singing together with a unity they hadn't managed since capture. Some of the Americans set down their serving dishes to listen, their faces reflecting curiosity and respect. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence. Then, from the American band, came the opening notes of When the Saints Go Marching, in a gospel tune transformed into jazz, full of energy and hope. The trumpet player grinned as he played, and several of the American soldiers began to clap along. Danny Morrison appeared again, this time with a harmonica. He caught Carlo's eye and gestured to the Italian prisoners. You know this one? They didn't, but it didn't matter. Music had become the language that worked when words failed. The Americans played their songs, the Italians sang theirs, and in the spaces between, something shifted. Not friendship. Perhaps that would be asking too much. But recognition. The acknowledgement that the men across the table were not so different from themselves. Carlo found himself laughing. Actually laughing when Enzo attempted to clap along to a particularly fast jazz number and got the rhythm completely wrong. Others joined in the laughter, Italian and American both. The sound bright and genuine, in a way that felt like defiance against the war raging across the world. Captain Harris returned to the microphone at the front of the hall as the evening wound down. He waited for quiet, his expression still controlled but perhaps touched with something softer around the eyes. This war will end, he said in Italian, then English. When it does, you'll go home to your families. We'll go home to ours. What happens between now and then, how we treat each other, that's something we'll all have to live with. He paused, scanning the room. Tonight, I hope we've shown you that America keeps its word. You surrendered honorably. You'll be treated honorably. That's not a luxury. It's the law. And it's the right thing to do. The speech was simple, almost plain. But after the feast, after the music, after the impossible evening they'd just experienced, the words landed with weight. Carlo saw several prisoners nodding, their faces reflecting a confusion that mirrored his own. How could their enemy also be their protector? How could the men who'd shot at them now serve them dinner? There were no easy answers. Perhaps there were no answers at all. But as the prisoners filed out of the recreation hall and into the warm August night, their stomachs full and their minds reeling. Something had fundamentally changed. The fear that had consumed them for 7 days had been replaced by something more complicated, a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps they might survive this war after all. Not just physically, but with their humanity intact. Carlo walked beside Enzo under stars that looked nothing like the stars over Italy but were somehow comforting anyway. Neither spoke. They were both thinking about the same thing, how a dinner had accomplished what no speech, no rule, no threat could have achieved. It had made them believe, just a little, in the possibility of mercy. The morning after the dinner felt different. Carlo woke to the same thin mattress, the same wooden ceiling beams, the same August heat already building in the barracks. But something inside him had shifted. He'd slept through the night without nightmares for the first time since capture. Work assignments continued as normal. Carlo's group returned to the soybean fields, but the oppressive tension that had hung over the camp had lifted. Prisoners spoke in normal tones rather than fearful whispers. A few even joked quietly with each other, testing whether laughter was still allowed. The guards seemed different too. Or perhaps the Italians were simply seeing them differently. The young private who usually supervised Carlo's work detail, a tall kid from Texas named William Hayes, actually smiled when he greeted them that morning. Not a superior's smile, but something almost friendly. "Good work yesterday," Hayes said in halting Italian, gesturing at the rows of neat, weed-free plants. Farm owner was pleased. It was a small thing, this acknowledgement of their labor, but it mattered. Carlo nodded his thanks and watched Hayes settle under his usual shade tree with a paperback novel. The guard's rifle remained propped beside him, but his hand never strayed toward it. The message was clear. "We're watching, but we're not afraid of you." That afternoon, Captain Harris appeared at the field carrying a crate. The prisoners straightened, uncertain what this unexpected visit meant. Harris set the crate down and opened it, revealing bottles of cold water and what looked like fresh fruit apples, possibly peaches. "Break time," Harris announced. 15 minutes. The prisoners approached cautiously. Real fruit was a luxury even before the war. Carlo accepted an apple from Harris's hand, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. He expected the captain to move away quickly, maintaining professional distance. Instead, Harris stayed, studying Carlo's face with that same assessing look he'd worn during their first encounter. "You're an officer," Harris said. It wasn't a question. "Lieutenant," Carlo confirmed. "Infantry." Before, he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had led to this moment. "College?" Harris asked. Carlo nodded, surprised. "University of Rome. Engineering. 2 years before I was drafted." "Georgetown," Harris replied. "History. Finished just before Pearl Harbor." He pulled out an apple for himself, polishing it absently on his sleeve. "Strange how we end up where we end up." They stood in silence for a moment. Two educated men on opposite sides of a war neither had chosen. Eating apples under a brutal sun, 6,000 miles from their homes. Carlo searched for something to say that wouldn't sound either obsequious or bitter. "Why did you do it?" he finally asked. "The dinner. It wasn't required." Harris was quiet long enough that Carlo thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "My brother was killed at Anzio. Marines. He was 22. Harris looked out across the fields, his jaw tight. The prisoners who surrendered there, Italian soldiers who'd given up, they were treated according to protocol. Given food, water, medical care, because that's what civilized people do. Carlo felt his chest constrict. "I'm sorry about your brother." "So am I." Harris turned back to Carlo, and his eyes were hard, but not cruel. "When I got this assignment, I could have made all of you suffer. Could have taken my grief out on men who wore the same uniform as those who killed James. Would have been easy. Would have felt justified. But you didn't," Carlo said quietly. "No. Because James wouldn't have wanted that. He believed America stood for something better than revenge." Harris's expression softened slightly. "Besides, you're not my enemy anymore. War's almost over for Italy. Mussolini's regime is collapsing. You're just men now, same as us. The simple statement, "you're just men," carried more weight than any formal speech could have. Carlo found himself nodding, unable to speak around the unexpected emotion clogging his throat. Harris started to walk away, then paused. "You play cards, Lieutenant?" "Some," Carlo admitted, confused by the question. "Thursday evenings, some of the officers play poker in the administrative building. You're welcome to join if you want. Bring a couple of your men who speak decent English." Harris smiled faintly. "We'll still take your money, but at least you'll have a chance to lose it honestly." Before Carlo could respond, Harris had moved on to check the other work details. Carlo stood holding his apple, trying to process what had just happened. An invitation to cards with the enemy, as if they were colleagues rather than captor and captive. That evening in the barracks, he told Enzo and Vincent about the exchange. Vincent's immediate reaction was suspicion. It's a trick to get information, but Enzo looked thoughtful. "Maybe he's lonely too," Enzo suggested. "Maybe he wants to talk to someone who understands what it's like. Being educated. Being far from home. Losing someone to this war. We all lost someone," Vincent said bitterly. "That doesn't make us friends." "No," Carlo agreed. "But maybe it makes us human to each other. And right now, that's enough." Thursday came. Carlo brought Enzo and a corporal named Anthony Rossi who'd worked as a translator before the war. They approached the administrative building nervously, unsure if the invitation had been genuine or if they'd misunderstood. But Harris met them at the door with a nod and led them to a back room where 3 other American officers waited around a table. The introductions were awkward. Lieutenant Jack Foster, Captain Robert Chen, Major Thomas Daniels, names and ranks that meant nothing yet. But when the cards were dealt and the first hand began, something eased. Poker was poker regardless of language or nationality. The rules were universal. The bluffing, the calculation, the small stakes gambling, these were activities that transcended war. They played for matchsticks, since no one had real money. Chen turned out to be a terrible poker player who couldn't hide his reactions, making everyone else's job easier. Foster was quiet but strategic. Daniels told stories about his grandmother in Brooklyn who'd once won $200 in a church basement game. Harris played competently but without passion, as if the cards were less important than the act of sitting together. Halfway through the evening, during a break to stretch their legs, Foster pulled out photographs of his wife and baby daughter. "Sarah's 8 months now," he said, his voice soft with longing. "I've never met her. She was born while I was already overseas." Enzo produced his own worn photograph, the girl named Lucia standing beside a fountain in Rome, her dark hair catching sunlight, her smile bright and hopeful. "I was supposed to marry her before I shipped out," he explained. "But there wasn't time. I don't even know if she's still waiting." "She's waiting," Foster said with certainty. "Look at that smile. That's a woman who knows how to hold on." They shared other photographs, then Carlo's sister Maria looking serious in her nursing uniform, Daniels's childhood farm in Wisconsin, Chen's parents standing proud in front of their San Francisco restaurant that had been closed when Japanese internment began, and all Asians became suspect. "They did nothing wrong," Chen said quietly, his jaw tight. 70 years in this country, American citizens, but fear doesn't care about citizenship. The bitterness in his voice resonated with Carlo in unexpected ways. They were enemies, technically, but they were also young men caught in systems beyond their control, trying to maintain dignity in undignified times, looking at photographs of people they loved and wondering if they'd ever see them again. The poker game continued, but it had become secondary. What mattered was the conversation, the shared humanity, the slow recognition that the propaganda on both sides had been exactly that propaganda designed to make killing easier by making the enemy less human. When the evening ended, and Carlo, Enzo, and Anthony walked back to their barracks under stars that had witnessed countless wars and would witness countless more, they didn't speak about the card game or who'd won. Instead, they walked in companionable silence, each processing the strange reality that their captors had become something more complicated than enemies. Not quite friends, that would be too much, too soon, but no longer simply the other side. Perhaps, Carlo thought, that was how wars actually ended, Not with grand treaties or formal surrenders, but with moments like these sitting across a table from men you'd been taught to hate, discovering they loved their families and missed home and feared death just as much as you did. It was a small thing, this recognition. But small things, repeated over time, had a way of becoming large. 2 weeks after the dinner, Captain Harris announced during morning assembly that prisoners would be permitted to write letters home. 1 letter per month, subject to censorship, but guaranteed delivery through the Red Cross. The news rippled through the ranks with a mixture of joy and apprehension. What could they say? How could they explain what was happening? Carlos sat at the barracks table that evening, fresh paper before him, trying to find words that wouldn't sound insane to his family. If he told the truth that he was being treated well, fed properly, allowed recreation and conversation with his captors, would they think he'd been brainwashed? Or worse, that he'd collaborated with the enemy? Enzo had no such hesitations. He wrote furiously, filling page after page with details about the camp, the food, the kindness shown to them. "I want Lucia to know I'm alive," he explained when Carlo asked if he wasn't worried about censorship. "I want her to know I'm coming home. Everything else is just details." Vincent, predictably, was more cynical. "They'll read every word," he muttered, writing in careful, sparse sentences. "Anything I say will be used to judge me later. Better to keep it simple." Carlo finally began writing to Maria. "Dear sister, I am alive and well in America. We are treated according to international law and lack for nothing essential. I think of home every day. Tell mother and father I am safe and will return when this war ends. I hope you are also safe and that your work at the hospital continues. Rome is in my heart, always. Your brother, Carlo." It felt inadequate, these few sentences to encompass months of terror and confusion and unexpected grace. But what else could he say? That the Americans who'd bombed Italian cities were now serving him turkey and playing cards with him? That he was beginning to see his enemies as men rather than monsters? Such truths were too complicated for a censored letter. Father Russo, making his rounds through the barracks, offering comfort and counsel, paused beside Carlo's table. "Having trouble?" the priest asked gently. "I don't know what to say. The truth sounds like propaganda. Lies feel wrong." Father Russo nodded thoughtfully. "Then say what matters most. That you're alive. That you haven't forgotten them. That love persists even across oceans and wars." He smiled sadly. Sometimes the simplest truths are enough. That night, Carlo dreamed of home for the first time since capture. Not nightmares of Rome burning, but memories of better times walking with Maria along the Tiber at sunset. His mother's kitchen filled with the smell of Sunday dinner. His father reading the newspaper in his favorite chair while summer light streamed through the windows. He woke with tears on his face and found Enzo already awake, sitting by the window and looking out at the unfamiliar American landscape. "I had a dream," Enzo said quietly without turning. "I was back in Rome. Lucia and I were getting married in Santa Maria in Trastevere, and everyone we loved was there. When I woke up, I was happy for a moment. Then I remembered where I was. We'll go home," Carlo said, though he had no authority to make such promises. "The war is ending. Italy is out. We're not combatants anymore. Eventually, they'll repatriate us." "And then what?" Enzo asked. "How do we explain this to people who weren't here? They'll ask what the camps were like, and we'll say they fed us turkey and played jazz and treated us like human beings. They'll think we were cowards who had it easy while others fought and died." It was a fear Carlo hadn't articulated but recognized immediately. How could you explain to someone who'd suffered under occupation that your captivity had been bearable, that your captors had shown mercy when mercy wasn't required? It felt like betrayal somehow, even though it was simply the truth. "Maybe," Carlo said slowly. "We don't explain. We just live. We go home, rebuild our lives, love the people who waited for us. And if anyone asks, we tell them we survived. That's all anyone needs to know." But privately, he knew it wasn't enough. The experience of this camp, of Captain Harris and Danny Morrison and the impossible dinner, had changed something fundamental inside him. He couldn't simply return to who he'd been before. That Carlo had believed in clear sides, in evil empires and righteous causes. This Carlo knew that goodness and cruelty lived in every nation, in every heart, and that choosing which to act upon was the only thing that separated civilization from barbarism. The days developed a routine: work in the mornings, rest during the hottest afternoon hours, recreation in the evenings. The camp had acquired used books in Italian from somewhere Harris's doing. Carlo suspected, and a small library formed in one of the barracks. Men who hadn't touched a book in months rediscovered the pleasure of reading. Enzo became obsessed with American cookbooks, studying recipes and making careful notes. "When I go home," he explained, "I'm going to open a cafe. A little place in Trastevere. I'll make Italian food, but I'll also make some of these American dishes. Show people that good food is good food, regardless of where it comes from." Vincent rolled his eyes at this plan, but Carlo saw something valuable in it. Enzo was planning for a future, believing in life beyond the war. That was a kind of resistance in itself, refusing to let captivity destroy hope. Carlo found himself thinking more about Harris's words. "You're just men now." Was it that simple? Could identity shift so quickly from enemy to fellow human? He'd spent years being taught that Americans were materialistic monsters without culture or honor. Yet Harris had shown honor. Morrison had shown kindness. Even the guards who supervised work details treated them with casual respect rather than contempt. Perhaps, Carlo thought, the real enemy had never been America or Italy, but the forces that made young men into killers, that turned neighbors into enemies, that reduced complex humans into simple categories of us and them. One evening, during another poker game, Major Daniels mentioned casually that Italy had officially switched sides, joining the Allies against Germany. The news had come through military channels days earlier. But no one had known how to tell the Italian prisoners. Would they be relieved? Angry? Confused? Carlo felt all three emotions at once. Relief that Italy might be spared further destruction. Anger at the government that had led them into a disastrous war, and then abandoned the soldiers fighting it. Confusion about what this meant for his identity. Was he still a prisoner of war or something else now? "Does this change anything?" he asked Harris quietly. "For us, I mean, the prisoners." Harris shrugged. "Legally, maybe. Practically, not much. You're still enemy combatants who surrendered before the switch. You'll still be held until proper repatriation can be arranged. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe it means going home happens sooner rather than later." Going home. The words conjured both longing and fear. Carlo wanted to see Rome again, to embrace his family, to walk familiar streets and taste familiar food. But he also knew he was no longer the person who'd left. The war had carved pieces out of him and filled the empty spaces with experiences that could never be fully shared or understood by those who hadn't lived them. Still, he wrote in his next letter to Maria, "I dream of home every night. Tell Mother I want her chicken cacciatore more than anything in the world. Tell Father I remember everything he taught me. Tell yourself that I'm counting the days until I can see your face again." Simple truths, as Father Russo had suggested. Because sometimes, when the world was too complicated to explain, simple truths were the only ones worth holding on to. The radio announcement came through on a warm September morning while the prisoners were at breakfast. Captain Harris appeared in the mess hall doorway, his expression grave but not hostile. Behind him, several guards stood at attention. The room fell silent, forks suspended mid-air, every eye fixed on the American captain. "Effective September 8th, Harris said in clear Italian, "the Kingdom of Italy has signed an armistice with the Allied forces. Mussolini's government has fallen. Italy is no longer at war with the United States." For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The words hung in the air, too large to immediately grasp. Then chaos erupted. Not violent chaos, but emotional. Men leapt to their feet, some cheering, others breaking into tears. Paolo Ricci threw his arms around Giuseppe Moretti, both men sobbing. Father Russo sank to his knees, hands clasped in prayer, his lips moving in rapid thanksgiving. Carlo remained seated, frozen by the magnitude of the moment. Beside him, Enzo had covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. Vincent stared straight ahead, his jaw working as he fought to control himself. "We can go home," Enzo choked out. "Carlo, we can go home," but Harris raised his hand, and gradually the room quieted enough for him to continue. "This changes your status legally, but practically, transportation must be arranged. The war in Europe continues. Repatriation will happen, but it will take time. Weeks, possibly months. You will remain here until proper arrangements can be made through the International Red Cross." The joy in the room dimmed slightly, tempered by this reality. Home existed, but it wasn't yet within reach. Still, knowledge that the waiting had an endpoint transformed everything. Men who'd been going through motions began to make actual plans. Conversations turned from "if we survive" to "when we get home." That afternoon, the camp erupted in celebration. Someone produced a harmonica. Others sang. The Americans, recognizing that this was a moment that needed to happen, relaxed supervision and allowed the prisoners to gather in the central square. No work details went out. For one day, the usual order suspended. Carlo found himself sitting on the steps of his barracks with Harris, watching the impromptu festival. Italian folk songs mixed with laughter and occasional tears. Men danced with each other in the absence of women, their movements clumsy but joyful. "How do you feel?" Harris asked quietly. Carlo considered the question carefully. "Like I should be happier than I am. Relief is complicated," Harris said. "So is survival. You feel guilty for the ones who didn't make it this far." It was exactly right. Carlo thought of the men from his regiment who'd died in the desert, who'd never made it to surrender, who'd been buried in shallow graves thousands of miles from home. What right did he have to celebrate when they'd paid the ultimate price? "My brother would have liked you," Harris said unexpectedly. James was like that, always trying to understand different perspectives. Drove our father crazy. He wanted James to be a lawyer, but James was studying anthropology. Wanted to understand how cultures worked, why people did what they did. "He sounds like a good man," Carlo said. He was. Harris was quiet for a moment. "After he died, I was so angry. I wanted to hurt everyone who looked like the men who'd killed him. When they assigned me here, I thought maybe I'd get that chance, make prisoners' lives miserable legally, under the guise of following orders. But you didn't. No. Because somewhere between receiving the orders and arriving at this camp, I realized James wouldn't recognize the person I was becoming. He died believing America stood for something better than vengeance. And if I threw that away, then he died for nothing." The weight of Harris's words settled over both men. They sat in companionable silence, watching Enzo teach Danny Morrison how to dance the tarantella badly, with much laughter from the gathered crowd. The young American private stumbled over his own feet, while Enzo called out instructions in Italian that Morrison couldn't understand but tried to follow anyway. "What will you do when you go home?" Harris asked. "Finish my engineering degree, if the university still stands. Find work, rebuilding, whatever needs rebuilding." Carlo smiled faintly. "Italy will need a lot of rebuilding. And after that, live. Love someone, maybe. Have children who never know what war feels like." Carlo glanced at Harris. "Try to be the kind of man who deserves the mercy I was shown here." Harris nodded slowly. "That's a good answer." That evening, Father Russo held a special mass in the recreation hall where the dinner had taken place months earlier. Nearly every Italian prisoner attended, along with a handful of American soldiers who were Catholic or simply curious. The priest's voice was rough with emotion as he led them through familiar prayers, offering thanksgiving for survival and supplication for those who hadn't been as fortunate. When the service ended, Carlo remained seated while others filed out. The room felt sacred somehow, heavy with meaning beyond the religious ceremony. This was where fear had transformed into hope, where enemies had become complex humans, where he'd learned that mercy wasn't weakness but the hardest form of strength. "You staying all night?" Enzo asked from the doorway. Carlo shook his head and stood. Just remembering. Remembering what? That dinner. How terrified we were. How certain we were going to die. Carlo looked around the hall, seeing it both as it was now and as it had been that night, tables laden with food, music playing, possibilities opening. We were wrong about everything. Not everything, Enzo countered gently. We were right that it would change us, just not in the way we expected. They walked back to their barracks under stars that seemed brighter somehow. Sharper. The camp had transformed, too, no longer a prison exactly, but a way station, a place between one life and the next, where men from different worlds had briefly shared space and recognized each other's humanity. Carlo lay in his bunk that night, listening to the familiar sounds of men sleeping, Enzo's soft snoring, Vincent's occasional restless shifting, the distant murmur of guards changing shifts. Home waited on the other side of an ocean. Family, familiar streets, a language everyone spoke. But part of him would always remain here, in this unlikely place, shaped by kindness he'd never expected from people he'd been taught to hate. The war wasn't over. Not truly. Fighting continued in Europe and the Pacific. Men were still dying for causes they barely understood. But for Carlo Romano and 200 other Italian prisoners in a small American camp surrounded by cornfields, this particular war had ended not with violence but with the radical act of treating enemies as men. It was a small victory in a world full of defeats. But it was enough. November brought cold winds that swept across the flatlands, rattling windows and turning breath to vapor. The prisoners had been issued American military coats, surplus winter gear too warm for active combat zones but perfect for Midwest weather. Carlo watched the cornfields turn brown and the trees bare their branches, marking time until transportation could be arranged. The wait was harder now that homecoming was certain rather than hypothetical. Men grew restless, counting days, asking daily if there was news. Some withdrew into themselves, already mentally departed. Others threw themselves into activities, writing more letters, reading every book in the small library, helping with camp maintenance as if staying busy could speed time. The Thursday poker games continued, though they'd expanded to include more players, Italians and Americans mixing freely now, laughing at bad hands and worse jokes, communication happening through the universal language of cards and gestures and simple human connection. During one such game, Major Daniels mentioned casually that transport ships were being organized. Probably mid-December, he said, studying his cards. Red Cross is coordinating with Naval Command. You'll leave from New York, arrive in Naples, assuming the harbor's been repaired enough to receive vessels. The words should have brought pure joy. Instead, Carlo felt a strange melancholy settle over him. He'd spent months desperate to leave this place. Now, facing actual departure, he realized he would miss aspects of it. Not the captivity, certainly, but the people Harris and Morrison, and even Lieutenant Foster, with his terrible poker face. You'll keep in touch? Morrison asked Enzo, who'd become something like friends with the red-haired private over their shared love of cooking. How? Enzo asked practically. I don't have an address. You don't have mine. Write to the Red Cross. They'll forward it. Eventually, Morrison grinned. Besides, when I come to Italy after this war, and I will come, I want to see Rome and Venice, and all of it. I need to know where to find your cafe. If I manage to open one, Enzo said. But he was smiling. You will, Morrison said with certainty. You're too stubborn to let anything stop you. The farewell preparations began in earnest 2 weeks before departure. The prisoners' few possessions were inventoried, paperwork completed, medical examinations conducted to ensure everyone was fit for travel. It was during one of these examinations that the camp doctor, a quiet man named Robert Pierce, pulled Carlo aside. You had a fever when you arrived, Pierce said, checking his records. Signs of malnutrition, dehydration, possible infection. Do you remember? Carlo nodded. That first week was mostly a blur of fear and confusion. But he remembered feeling ill beyond the immediate shock of capture. You're healthy now, Pierce continued. Gained 20 pounds. No infections. Vitals strong. I wanted you to know that. Whatever happens when you go home, you're leaving here in good condition." He paused, then added more quietly, "That wasn't guaranteed. Some camps." He trailed off, leaving the unspoken horrors hanging in the air. "Thank you," Carlo said, and meant it, "for taking care of us." "Just doing my job," Pierce said gruffly, but his expression was pleased. 2 days before departure, Captain Harris organized a final gathering in the recreation hall. Not a feast this time. Resources were stretched thin as the war continued, but a simple meal and an opportunity to say proper goodbyes. The Italian prisoners and American staff sat together. The distinctions that had once seemed so important now largely dissolved. Harris stood to speak, his voice carrying across the room with the authority that had both frightened and reassured Carlo that first day. "When you arrived here," Harris began, "I saw you as my responsibility. Men I was charged with keeping alive and maintaining order among. Over these months, many of you have become more than that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "War forces us into categories: ally and enemy, friend and foe. But those categories are temporary. What persists is the choice we make about how to treat each other when we have power over those who are vulnerable." I hope his voice roughened slightly. "I hope we made the right choices here. I hope you'll carry that forward when you return home and rebuild your country." Father Russo stood next, his small frame seeming larger somehow as he spoke. "I came to this camp expecting to minister to broken men. Instead, I've witnessed something I did not expect: the possibility of grace even in captivity. Not all prisons are physical. Sometimes we imprison ourselves in hatred, in the certainty that those who oppose us are irredeemably evil. This place has taught me that such certainty is its own form of captivity." Others spoke. Vincent Santoro, surprisingly eloquent about second chances and the difficulty of changing long-held beliefs. Danny Morrison stumbling through a short speech in terrible Italian about friendship transcending borders. Lieutenant Foster reading a letter from his wife who'd expressed pride that he was serving in a facility that honored human dignity. When it was Carlo's turn, he stood slowly, aware of all eyes on him. He'd been practicing what to say, but now the prepared words seemed inadequate. "Before we came here," he began in English, halting, accented, but comprehensible. "We believed stories about Americans. That you were cruel, without honor, that surrender meant torture or death. We were wrong." He switched to Italian for the more complex thoughts, knowing Harris and others who'd learned the language would understand. "You showed us that enemy is not the same as evil. That laws can mean something even during war. That choosing kindness when you could choose cruelty is the highest form of strength." His throat tightened. "We cannot repay you for the mercy you showed. We can only promise to remember it, to carry it home, to tell the truth about what happened here, even if others don't believe us. And perhaps, if we're fortunate, to show others the same mercy when we have the chance." The room was silent for a moment. Then Enzo began to clap, and others joined until the applause filled the space. Carlo sat down quickly, embarrassed by the attention but grateful to have found words that felt true. The final night in the barracks was long and mostly sleepless. Men whispered to each other in the darkness, sharing contact information that might or might not work, making promises to stay in touch that might or might not be kept. Enzo carved a wooden eagle, his signature piece, and left it on Morrison's bed with a note. Vincent, who'd remained cynical throughout, quietly thanked Carlo for keeping him sane during the worst periods of doubt. Morning came cold and clear. The prisoners assembled in the central square one last time, their few belongings packed in bags provided by the Americans. A line of trucks waited to transport them to the train station, beginning the long journey to New York Harbor and the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Harris moved through the ranks, shaking hands with prisoners he'd come to know. When he reached Carlo, he held out his hand formally. "Lieutenant Romano. Safe travels." Carlo took the offered hand, then impulsively pulled Harris into a brief embrace. Awkward, quick, but genuine. "Captain Harris, thank you for everything. Be well," Harris said simply. "Build something good when you get home." The trucks rumbled to life. The prisoners climbed aboard, waving to the Americans who'd guarded them, fed them, shown them unexpected humanity. As the vehicles pulled away, Carlo looked back at the camp that had been prison and sanctuary both, seeing it shrink in the distance until it disappeared entirely. Beside him, Enzo was crying silently. Carlo said nothing, just gripped his friend's shoulder as familiar American landscape rolled past the truck windows. They were going home. After everything, the terror of battle, the certainty of death, the impossible mercy, the long months of waiting, they were finally going home. But they were not the same men who'd left. The war had taken pieces of them that could never be recovered. Yet it had also given them something unexpected. The knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, light persisted. That enemies could become teachers. That mercy, when least expected, had the power to transform. It was enough to build a life on. It would have to be. 12 years after the war ended, Carlo Romano stood in his restaurant in the heart of Rome, watching the evening rush begin. La Cena Americana occupied a converted townhouse near the Piazza Navona, its windows glowing warm against the autumn twilight. Inside, waiters moved between tables carrying plates of food that honored both Italian tradition and the American experience that had marked him so deeply. The menu was Carlo's autobiography and dishes his grandmother's carbonara alongside the turkey and mashed potatoes he'd first tasted as a terrified prisoner. Traditional Roman artichokes, paired with American-style apple pie. Wine from Lazio served in glasses imported from Pennsylvania. Critics called it fusion before the term existed. Carlo called it honest. On the wall near the entrance hung a faded photograph in a simple frame. The recreation hall at the POW camp. Long tables set for a feast. American soldiers serving Italian prisoners. The banner reading a message Carlo had translated years later. Peace and brotherhood. Below it, a small plaque Carlo had commissioned himself. Where enemies became men. November 1943. Regular customers knew the story. Tourists asked about the photograph, and Carlo would tell them not the full story, which would take hours, but the essence of it, that he'd expected execution and received dinner. That mercy had saved not just his life, but something more essential, his ability to believe in human goodness. Maria worked the front desk, greeting guests with the warm efficiency she'd perfected as a wartime nurse. She'd married a doctor from the same hospital, had 3 children who occasionally helped in the restaurant, and remained Carlo's closest confidant. She understood, in ways his wife sometimes couldn't, why certain dates marked him, why American music made him quiet, why he insisted on treating every customer with dignity, regardless of how they behaved. "Someone to see you," Maria said one evening, gesturing toward a man standing uncertainly near the entrance. American, by his clothing and bearing. Middle-aged, gray beginning to show at his temples. He held a worn envelope in his hands. Carlo approached, his practiced smile in place. "Welcome to La Cena Americana. Table 4. He stopped. The face was older, weathered by years and experience, but unmistakable. Red hair fading to rust, freckles less pronounced, but still visible. The same earnest expression. "Danny Morrison," Carlo breathed. Morrison's face broke into a wide grin. "Took me 3 years to track you down, Carlo." The Red Cross wasn't helpful. But Enzo. He gestured outside where a small figure was arguing animatedly with a taxi driver about fare. Enzo wrote back. "Finally. Said you'd opened this place. Said I had to come." They embraced, laughing. And suddenly Carlo was 25 again, sitting in a prison camp in the American Midwest, learning that enemies were just people who hadn't met yet. Enzo entered, having apparently won his argument with the taxi driver. His cafe in Trastevere was thriving. He'd kept his promise to himself, recreating American recipes alongside Italian classics, building a business on the principle that good food transcended borders. Now, seeing Morrison, he let out a whoop of joy and rushed over to grip the American in a bear hug. "You came. You actually came. Said I would, didn't I?" Morrison looked around the restaurant. his eyes bright with emotion. "This is beautiful, Carlo. Really beautiful." They sat at Carlo's private table near the kitchen, and Maria brought wine, frascati, crisp and cold. Morrison pulled letters from his envelope, carefully preserved correspondence that had somehow survived years and distance. Letters Enzo had written and Morrison had saved. Photographs. A wooden eagle with one wing slightly broken but still recognizable. "I kept it," Morrison said simply, holding up Enzo's carving. "Carried it through the rest of the war. Brought it home. My kids used to play with it when they were little. Now it sits on my desk at the insurance office in Des Moines." He laughed. "Not as glamorous as this, but it's a good life." They talked for hours, about families and children and the businesses they'd built, about the war's end and the difficult years of rebuilding, about Harris, who'd become a history professor at Georgetown, honoring his dead brother by teaching new generations about the cost of conflict, about Vincent Santoro, who'd returned to Sicily and opened a vineyard, about Father Russo, who'd written a book about grace in unexpected places and died quietly in his sleep at 73. "Do you think about it?" Morrison asked as the evening grew late and the restaurant began to empty. "The camp. That dinner. Every day," Carlo admitted, not always consciously. "But it shaped everything that came after. How I treat my staff. How I raise my children. The whole philosophy of this place," he gestured around the restaurant. "It comes from that night. From learning that showing dignity to those you have power over isn't weakness. It's civilization." Morrison nodded slowly. "Harris used to say something similar, that the measure of a country isn't how it treats its friends, but how it treats those who can't fight back." He smiled sadly. "We didn't always live up to that. But for a few months, in one camp, we tried." Enzo raised his glass. "To Captain Harris. To that impossible dinner. To the men who chose mercy. To enemies who became human," Morrison added. "To survival," Carlo finished, "and to building something worth surviving for." They drank. 3 men marked by war but not destroyed by it. Sitting in a restaurant in Rome that served as testimony to the possibility of grace. Outside, the eternal city continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to individual stories. But inside La Cena Americana, in the space between pasta and pie, between memory and hope, those stories persisted. The photograph on the wall watched over them, a frozen moment when the world could have gone one way and chose another. When bullets could have been served, but turkey was offered instead. When hatred was the easier path, but kindness was chosen. Not everyone made it to such moments. Not every story ended with friendship and reunion and restaurants that served American apple pie in the heart of Rome. But this one did. And on the nights when darkness seemed overwhelming and history felt like an endless cycle of cruelty, Carlo would look at that photograph and remember that mercy was possible, even in war. That enemies were just people who hadn't yet recognized each other's humanity. That a single choice to serve dinner instead of death could echo across decades and oceans, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very blessed, those echoes built bridges strong enough to last a lifetime. The restaurant closed late that night. Morrison had a hotel room but was in no hurry to leave. They sat together in the quiet aftermath of service, 3 old soldiers who'd somehow become brothers, drinking wine and telling stories that grew funnier and sadder with each retelling. When Morrison finally stood to go, he paused at the photograph one more time. "You really didn't know," he said softly. "None of you knew we were serious about treating you right. We'd been taught not to expect mercy," Carlo replied. "So when it came, it was miracle." "Not a miracle," Morrison corrected gently. "Just people choosing to be decent. That shouldn't be miraculous. But I guess, given human history, maybe it is." He left, promising to return before his visit to Italy ended, and Carlo was alone with the photograph and his memories and the lingering smell of the evening's cooking. Maria had gone home hours ago. The staff had finished cleaning. The ancient city breathed quietly outside his windows. Carlo turned off the lights one by one, moving through his restaurant like a priest through a cathedral. This was his life's work, not just the food or the business, but the testimony it represented. That cruelty was not inevitable. That enemies could become friends. That choosing grace, even when vengeance was justified, was the highest human achievement. He paused at the door, looking back at the dining room illuminated only by streetlight filtering through windows. The photograph on the wall caught a gleam, that frozen moment of impossible kindness still vivid after so many years. "Thank you," Carlo whispered to the memory. To Captain Harris and Danny Morrison, and all the Americans who'd chosen mercy when punishment was easier. For showing us, for saving us, for teaching us that being human is a choice we make every day. Then he locked the door and walked out into the Roman night, carrying within him the knowledge that he'd been given an extraordinary gift, the chance to pass on the grace he'd received, to serve his own unlikely dinners, to be, in his small way, the kind of man who deserved the mercy he'd been shown. It was enough. It was everything. It was the best revenge against war's attempt to destroy humanity, to live fully, love completely, and build something beautiful on the foundation of unexpected kindness. La Cena Americana would open again tomorrow, and the day after. And every day Carlo had left, serving meals to strangers who might become friends, telling stories to those who would listen, keeping alive the memory of a night when enemies stopped being enemies and became simply men, sharing a meal, searching for home,